Good morning, all. I will continue the same theme looking at, as Dr. Malakeh, on the links between security and development. I am looking for my slides, so that one? There we go. And it's a theme and issue, this link between development and security, which has been around in the policy discourse for 10, 15 years. I think certainly Kofi Annan put a strong print on it in the mid-2000s in his report on In Greater Freedom. But although it's been within the policy discourse, there are still questions about how concretely those links can be strengthened. And I think that representing a financial institution, the World Bank, it's been interesting for me to see the degree to which, slowly but surely, development institutions, financial institutions, are increasingly engaging in dialogue with those from the military, from defense, from ministries of interior. And I think that that's an important dialogue that should obviously continue and be strengthened. So it's within that kind of spirit that I'm here. I think probably 10 years ago or so, it would be quite rare for someone from the development institution or a financial institution to be in such a discussion. So I think it's certainly very welcome. What I'm going to do just in a short period of time is to look at this question of resourcing and to look at some trends related to military expenditure in Africa, and then some of the work that the World Bank and some of your ministries of finance have been doing in terms of opening the lid on defense and police expenditures, and how those can be made more effective and more sustainable. So to start with, I'm just sharing a slide which I'm sure in general terms represents very much the kinds of discussions that you've been having last week and this week. And all this does is represent violent event data on the African continent, and the kinds of threats that you, sitting in your respective ministries, face every day, every year. Threats relating to piracy, to trafficking, to insurgencies, to political violence. And much of that is within regional complexes and not necessarily just within one country. So you have the whole question of violence moving across sub-regions and border areas. And I think as I said at the beginning, what's interesting about looking at these kinds of threats is the degree to which that has clearly an enormous negative impact on development outcomes, poverty outcomes, poverty reduction outcomes, and the vicious circle that as development deteriorates, then that means there are less resources available for the public purse, for the budget, in order to provide security and justice services. And I think this is why the conversation has changed, where security and development used to be at opposites, and the way in which development actors looked at security was say, well, it's a public good, but it kind of crowds out education funding, health funding, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Whereas now it's more a conversation to sit down with governments to say, how can we help you to make the security of your people, the security of your nation, more effective? How can the scarce resources, either public or private, how can those be really harnessed for an effective set of security institutions? So it's not such an oppositional conversation. It's really looking at efficiency and effectiveness of budgets, whether they be used for a health budget or, more interesting for us, for a security budget. So in terms of military spending, not looking at the security sector more broadly, but military spending over the last decade or so in Africa has been quite high compared to other regions. And this is data from SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, which publishes every year on military expenditures. And it shows the gradation of those countries which are spending the highest on the military sector, and shows in proportion to the other regions with a starting base of 100 in 2004 that over the last 10 years Africa has been exceeding in proportion, other regions. And then certain countries such as Chad, Algeria, Angola have been, relatively speaking, quite high spenders on the sector. That, however, has dropped, as was mentioned by Dr. Malake, because of the quite dramatic fall in commodity prices over the last couple of years. So what SIPRI is telling us this year was that military spending overall in Africa was $37 billion. That was in 2015, which represented a fall by 5.3%, but is still 68% higher than it was in 2006. So overall, African militaries are spending more money, but there is a little downtick. And those downticks are some examples by country. For example, in Angola and Chad, particularly because of the fall in oil prices, a small decrease in Nigeria, and then increases in Mali and increases in Kenya. Again, that's a kind of proxy indicator of the concerns that those respective countries are having vis-a-vis the Sahel crisis and the crisis coming out of Somalia. So those are the trends in military expenditure. However, we have to be a little bit careful because SIPRI only looks at open source data. And often there is a discrepancy, there's a difference between what SIPRI gets in terms of the information that it puts on its database in Stockholm, in Sweden, and what is actually spent. And most often it's reflected as a percentage of GDP. And all I've done here is just articulate more specifically what that means in dollar terms by country. So for example, Burundi spent something like 3% of GDP on military, and that represented $68 million last year. Sierra Leone, it was only 1%. That was around $40 million. So often there is quite a big difference between that actual published figure and actually what's spent. So I've used an example out of Africa, which is a dramatic example because it's Afghanistan, which is a very much an internationalized, conflict-affected country with a very large external financing and large external military presence. And because of the counterinsurgency operations, most of the budget that is going into the military and security services is financed by external partners, particularly the US government. And so here we have a security sector where only some 6% is provided from domestic revenues. And obviously that's an enormous difference between the balance between domestic revenues and external revenues. And this is something from the development side which would cause a real concern to a Minister of Finance, because how can that be sustainable? When your domestic revenues are so low, how can you afford to continue the security sector which you have when so little of it is paid out of your own national budget? So when we look at military expenditure, there is data out there, but I think it's more important to really unpick exactly the kind of expenditures which are coming onto budget, and what's the balance between international and national financing. So in terms of specific trends over time, I just wanted to pick up a few relating to conflict-affected countries. And the first trend is to say that not necessarily high military spending leads to greater security, or specifically high military spending does not necessarily lead to greater human security. One of the trend lines which was highlighted by the World Development Report of 2011 was the fact that peace agreements don't necessarily lead to a massive reduction in homicides or violence, rates of violence. And here we have two examples from Afghanistan and South Sudan, where the red bars indicate increases in military spending over time, and then the blue line represents rates of fatalities, of homicides. And so clearly governments need to see what is the most effective way that resources can be used in order to reduce rates of violence. And that's clearly a critical policy question for the likes of yourselves. Other trends relating to post-conflict scenarios is that in some settings there can be a reduction in military personnel. And that's the slide on the left relating to three classic post-conflict countries in Africa, which for the moment are relatively successful. And that is Liberia, Mozambique, and Sierra Leone. With a reduction in military personnel, that usually leads to a reduction in military expenditure. And that is often what governments call a peace dividend. In other words, they can spend less on the military and therefore spend more on social services, on infrastructure, and general development. And also, we only have two comparisons here, but you can see that generally in post-conflict settings, there's a rebalancing of the kind of forces and the posture that you have, particularly from military forces to policing ones. Now, a tool that we have been using with ministries of finance is what's called a public expenditure review. And the World Bank has been using this tool for many years in other sectors to look at how effective, how efficient, and how affordable government spending is in a particular area of life. And increasingly what we've been using this tool for is to look at and help ministries of finance, ministries of defense and interior to look at those questions, but with a focus on the security sector. What we need to stress is that it's a tool. It's not actually a policy document. So it's not for the World Bank or the World Bank working with the United Nations or a bilateral partner to say to a country whether it should be spending more money on tanks versus soldiers, or spending less money on the military and more money on health and education. But it gives the kind of data and analysis which allows decision makers at the cabinet level to look at how effective and affordable that kind of spending is. And it's important because it looks at this whole question of this nexus between security and development. and particularly how effective those security structures are in providing for citizen security. And what we look at is the whole question of effectiveness. So, for example, are budgets in line with the kind of strategies that you are rolling out? If the budget is not in line with your strategy, then clearly there's a complete mismatch, and that leads to ineffective security. Secondly, it looks at this whole question of affordability and sustainability, and trying to prevent what we call the Afghanistan scenario, where you have a massive security structure and architecture which clearly cannot be afforded by the nation state itself. We also look at questions of efficiency and public financial management. And this gets into the detail of questions around payroll, around registration and verification of men and women in uniform, questions around procurement, whether the procuring of contracts for non-lethal issues such as food and uniform, or lethal equipment such as big spend items such as aircraft or tanks, is being done in a fair, equitable, competitive way. And so what we've seen over time is that ministries of finance are coming to us because of these big issues around resources and the need to hold a more effective discussion with ministries of defense and ministries of interior around critical challenges, the threats that I mentioned right at the beginning, and how to deploy more effective responses to those. And I just list a number of examples there. Central African Republic in 2009 and 16, Liberia, Mali and Niger, Somalia, and Guinea-Bissau. And just to give a few more details on those examples as I close. In Liberia, the government came to us because of the critical question about what would happen when the UN peacekeeping was going to begin to withdraw. And up to now, UNMIL has provided most of the peacekeeping and security provision, stabilization provision in the country. And the government came to us and the UN mission to say, well, in what ways can we prepare for that reduction in peacekeeping forces, and how much would that cost? And is there going to be some kind of budgetary gap that we will need to fill? And so the bank and the UN worked with the government, and we came up with a review that pointed out there was going to be a fiscal gap. It was something like $75 to $100 million, and some of the ways in which the government could begin to fill in as the peacekeeping mission withdraws over time. In Somalia, we've looked at a similar set of questions, because there we don't have a UN mission. Obviously, we have the AU mission, AMISOM, and the counterinsurgency. And there we've looked particularly at three questions around affordability, because we're dealing with a government which has extremely low revenues. We've looked at the whole question around public financial management, because they've had a real challenge in terms of ensuring that soldiers and policemen get properly paid and on time, as well as inserting relatively neutral data and analysis into a very charged and contested discussion as to what the army and police will look like once there is a federal settlement in that country. What is the relationship between the center and the periphery, between a federal government and the federal states that comprise that country? In Niger was clearly very much affected by the crisis in Mali and the Sahelian crisis overall. And there Niger was coming to both the bank and the IMF because they wanted to increase their military expenditures, but they were under a very tight fiscal framework. The IMF was imposing quite tight parameters on how much they could borrow. And the bank suggested doing some kind of expenditure review, so then the government could have a discussion both with its private and its public creditors as to how it was spending its money and what was required to boost its security architecture in relation to those threats. We've also done this kind of review with governments elsewhere. For example, in Latin America, particularly in relation to increasing rates of crime and violence, in Central America, in Mexico, in Peru, where it's not really been a military discussion, but it's looking at the effective use of policing and intelligence services to do with drugs trafficking and urban crime. So those are some examples. At the end of the day, I think it's been very helpful to get a much closer relationship between ministries of finance and the ministries, departments, and agencies that comprise the security sector. And I think this is something really to look at as a general trend going forward, and look forward to the questions and answers in the open discussion. Thank you very much.